Okay, lovely. So, welcome everyone to our next seminar on water and climate, which is the next big wave the world is facing after COVID-19. We would like to, inquire how or what lessons we can learn from COVID-19 to understand what we should do about the next wave, which will be inevitably coming in the next few years and decades. We have a very exciting panel today. Unfortunately, Alan Nicol had to cancel his participation for personal reasons. However, we have a great group of thinkers from around the world. I would like to welcome first Dr. Cecilia Tortajada, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Water Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. She is one of the key people in global water governance. She's a member of the OECD initiative in water governance. She has been the past president of the Water Resources Association from 2007 till 2009, and she's an honorary member of the International Water Resources Association. And she's the editor-in-chief of several journals, such as International Journal of Water Resources Development, which is actually getting a high impact factor as we speak, because it's becoming a lot more popular and important. She's Associate Editor of Water International and a number of other journals. Then we have Dr. Mark Mulligan, who is head of the Geography Department at King's College in London. Mark has been at King's since 1994. He's a physical geographer, and he is also an honorary fellow of the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Center, and he was an adjunct doctoral graduate faculty at Texas State University from 2007 until 12. Rachel McDonnell is the Strategic Program Director for Water, Climate Change and Resilience at the International Water Management Institute, based in the Rome office. She leads a team of researchers working on innovative data, technology policy and governance solutions to support countries adapting and building resilience to the challenges of a changing climate. Then we have Dr. Jeroen Warner. He is, what is called a hoofddocent in Dutch. He's assistant professor in the Risk and Disaster Studies Department at Wageningen University. Jeroen is a long-standing thinker on water issues in relation to the social side, so we're very pleased to have him here as well. And then finally, last but not least, we have Professor Rabia Mokhtar, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut. He founded Texas A&M's Water Energy Food Nexus Initiative and the Water Energy Food Health Nexus Renewable Resources Initiative at the American University of Beirut. So he's a systems thinker who provides a very useful integrated approach to water and other systems. Dr. Mokhtar also is a governor of the World Water Council, an executive board member of International Water Resources Association, and a fellow of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. So I'd like to welcome everyone again. And now I'd like to hand over to Rachel Bahn in order to do the next part. Rachel, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Bahn. Introductory statement on the following. What are your observations on the impact of COVID-19 on global food security, specifically the lessons we can draw for water and climate? We'd like to kick off. Rachel McDonnell, the floor is yours for 4 minutes, please.
Good morning, Martin. Good morning, Rachel. Good morning to everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today to think about these implications of this wave of COVID on top of those other waves of climate change. I love the cartoon that you sent out. And one thing you see, the immediate impact of COVID is the demand for water to wash hands. This is how we're going to manage it. But as we see countries bring in measures to control the virus, we see many. What we're seeing at EME is we're calling them first, second, third order shocks, these waves of these impacts on water and food systems. In this webinar so far, you've had people talk about, for example, shortening the food chain. There was some fantastic discussion in last week's podcast. And what we see, one of the things we're wanting to think about is, as we're considering this, is what is the impact on more local water resources? Is it that we're going to be growing water food more locally, but the water there is reduced, it's unsustainable? We've seen in the past moves towards more local food self-sufficiency, and those impacts on groundwater systems, particularly in the MENA region, on both groundwater levels and on water quality, particularly salinity, are still there today from policies 15, 20 years ago. So within this, I lead the strategic program at EME on water, climate change and resilience. And within that, we look at both climate change adaptation and resilience, but also water extremes. So we have been looking at COVID impacts and how that plays out with climate change and those changes. So we've been conceptualizing this in terms of co-disasters and co-benefits. What happens where you have COVID in an area that's already recovering from a drought or a flood? How does these two ripples that are coming from the pond, are they exacerbating the system? And from what we can see in the countries that we work in Bihar and India, from the recent floods, and Morocco, where there's recent droughts, is COVID is very difficult to manage in these areas. And we're beginning to look at, these external shocks coming together. And what does that mean? We're busy tracking the monsoon that's coming through at the moment. What will that mean for managing COVID, and how will COVID impact our ability to manage the impacts of that monsoon? But we're also looking at in terms of co-benefits. So what happens where we have been working on climate change adaptation, resilience building, and we've been able to support more sustainable water management in areas. And because we have that better water management, those areas are able to respond better to COVID. So we've been looking in Nepal, we've been working in some Western areas, but Western basins in Nepal, helping to resurrect basins with nature-based solutions by planting trees and by resurrecting some of the systems. So the springs have come back into life there. So in these communities now, we have freshwater supplies, which hopefully will be helping those communities deal with COVID. So co-benefits, co-disasters, thinking about what the water implications are in many of these ways, many of the solutions that are being put forward now for rethinking our food system is what we're also tackling here at EME. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that statement and eliminating some of the challenges and the possibilities. We'll hear next from Mark Mulligan. Mark, the floor is yours for your introductory statement.
Thank you, Rachel. So lessons for water and climate. I think we now know, as a result of the last few months of COVID, that big shifts and new norms are possible, but that they won't happen until there's no other choice, right? Acute challenges like the one we're having now will tend to generate rapid and significant responses, as we're seeing. However, chronic challenges like those that we have in water and in climate change may not generate such rapid and significant responses until they become acute. And so maybe that's an important lesson. I think another one that's very clear in my mind is that, national scale, top-down, institutional command and control structures are sometimes not good at dealing with a crisis. The top is slow, the top doesn't understand the challenges at the bottom, and the top are sometimes more interested in how the solutions reflect on them than how they address the issues at hand. And I think this is not just a case for governments, but many types of institution. So I think we're seeing that perhaps a more bottom-up, decentralized focus is required in solving major challenges, particularly ones that are acute, where the goals and the incentives are set from the top, but the control and the operation and the innovation is very much from the front line. And then finally, there will be a vaccine for COVID, but there's no vaccine for sustainability. Solving climate change and protecting water resources will require sustained effort for as long as we, as humans, dominate the Earth. There's no vaccine that suddenly makes that stop. So any period in which our attention is diverted from that sustained effort we'll see a second wave, second peak in climate, environment, and water risk that may undo any good work that we're doing now. So I think we have to bear that very much in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll turn next to Rabia Maftar for his introductory statement.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see all of you. It's been a while, and I hope that we'll meet sometime soon, face to face. Let me maybe take the dry land perspective on COVID and its impact on water resources. I think what we're seeing in COVID, as has indicated already by Rachel and by Mark, that it is accelerating the processes that we have. So the financial crisis in Lebanon in particular and the region on top of COVID, on top of a chronic water scarcity, that's the manifestation that I'd like to focus on. And I'd like to start not by putting in solutions, but rather than challenges that we need to highlight. And I'd like to bring in the system that supports water resources in dry land that is interlinked with the food security, that's interlinked with climate, as indicated earlier by Rachel, and indicate that this system is very complex and the soil is at the core of it, and we understand very little. And focusing on soil, most of the knowledge we have in dry land, that soil, the fundamental aspect that allow us to address the sustainability that Mark mentioned, is lacking. Most of the knowledge of our interactions that we see in the soil, the plant, the food security, the water, is being imported from the north. And there's very little knowledge about the diversity, about the spatial variability in sparsity of the vegetation, of the rain for arid region. And that is, I think, is a fundamental issue that will not allow us to bridge those sustainability issues that has been discussed earlier. I'd like also to talk about fundamental issues of knowledge that we have lost, the green water space that we don't manage well, the recycling and the reuse that must be at the core of our resilience and sustainability, and the very fundamental issue of the interaction between water quality and water access. We ignore that much of our water, I'll give you an example in Lebanon, most of our water that is available, that could be available in springs and groundwater is not available because it's polluted. Pollution means a lot of energy, means a lot of technology that we don't have. So that brings again back the knowledge and the interaction with local. Most of the groundwater that we have in many parts of the region has been with a significant drawdown. The implication for this on small farmer is more energy, and that is cost that they cannot sustain. Along with all of this, I'd like to bring in, back in the few years ago, the UN Habitat made a projection, and I'd like to revisit that projection. It projected that 70% of the global population will be living in cities. With the COVID crisis, at least from our perspective here, sitting in the Middle East, many of the people that we know have migrated back to the villages. And I'd like us to really redesign this world in a fresh light. Is this what we want? Is this sustainable cities that we think of? 70% of our population are crammed in cities. Is that a solution for moving beyond COVID? And I'd like us to really, I'd like to question that, and the role of empowering livelihood of people in farmland, and looking at technologies such as precision agriculture, the role of mapping our resources, water resources with the cropping system, and really looking at a much larger perspective of how we manage our landscapes, and in particular, role of technologies to wean off the agriculture to the food resources. Today, in this region where it has the highest scarcity of water, we use technologies that efficiency for irrigation use is as high or is as low as 40 to 50%. And I think we need to really revisit that relationship between water and food. I will close with one point about the need for us to really have a system view of how we manage our water. COVID is one of those moments that have reflected or had allowed us to reflect on the role of water, health, food, energy, and livelihood. And I think a system view to addressing water resources is a must today, more important today than it has been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mahtar. We will turn now to Cecilia Topahada for her comments.
Yes, good afternoon from Singapore, and very nice to see you all. In my introduction, I would like to refer to the so-called global cities and the resilient cities. So this is an urban context, followed with comments on water supply. Now, the global cities, we have heard a lot about global cities and resilient cities. And it is said that global cities are those that are at the top. They are said to be the top competitive and performing cities, as well as those with the most potential in terms of human capital, municipal policies. This is the ideal world, right? Investment and commitment to build a technology path into the future. And these are the cities that attract and retain the talent. Now, the 2019 Global Cities Report includes New York, London, and Paris as the 3 top cities in the Global City Index. They are followed by Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Los Angeles, Chicago, Beijing, and so on. All these are highly international cities, which in the context of COVID-19 have been some of the most affected due to the mobility of their population. In the 2020 Global Cities Index, I am sure we're going to see a difference in what are these cities that are mentioned. But now let's see cities from another perspective, not as the ones that attract and that retain talent, but those that have the ability, and I quote, to absorb, recover, prepare for future economic, environmental, social, and institutional shocks, again, in the ideal world. And these are the resilient cities. But resilient cities are made by resilient people and by resilient governments, right? So these cities are those that have a dynamic economy where people have access to employment, services, education, all these that we see people are suffering of, where society is inclusive and cohesive, and where there are adequate natural resources and infrastructure that can meet basic needs. So more important, cities where there is clear leadership and management, lack of which we have seen plenty in the world during times of this COVID-19. So what we are seeing is that it is cities with the better leaders, with the populations that are more cohesive, with stronger social networks, the ones that are coping better with the present situation. In the case of Latin America, the UN, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a CLAC, they have mentioned that the effects of COVID-19 will cause the biggest recession in the region for decades. And this means in practice a sharp increase in unemployment with negative effects on poverty and inequality. And a tragedy of this is that this will also be because there will be a drop of remittances from workers, relatives working abroad. So if we go to water supply, which is always linked to sanitation, we know that tap water is clean, even during COVID-19 times, as long, because the treatments are meant to treat viruses. But this is as long as there were already systems before. Cases where water utilities are short of manpower, water utilities who cannot provide the clean water they are supposed to provide, they are just facing a bigger challenge than before. And with this, the population, the so-called customers, we all in the world, they are the ones who are suffering the most. And the most affected populations are always the most vulnerable ones that were mentioned already by Rachel, for example. So somebody who already was facing a problem is suffering of a bigger problem because the governments, national, state, local governments, they are not able to provide, they were never able to provide the service anyway. And now, during times of stressors, the situation becomes more difficult for the providers and more difficult for people who are receiving the services. So my point of view are always from the for urban water supply. Are we improving? Are we facing, what type of challenges we are facing during this time, which is more in terms of water supply that in the developing world is not clean. So during these times when we need it more, we as people from developing countries, we face bigger problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn for our final introductory statement to Gerard Warner.
Thank you. Let me first say that the COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic is not a surprise. Epidemics come around every couple of years or so, and some are much deadlier than this one. Think of malaria, for example, AIDS. I don't want to belittle this pandemic, but the reason why this is a global one and why we are now all in lockdown is that it has started to affect the middle class. Not only the middle class in countries, but also the global middle class, that is the OECD countries. And so there is a fair reason to discuss whether the cure and the ailment are in balance. I'm certainly not saying that we should now open the deadlock, but we should look at the second order victims of the COVID measures. So the people who actually are hurt by the lockdown more than by the COVID outbreak. That is the marginalized people in slums, people who depend on aid, who are suddenly not getting it anymore because it's no longer safe to do this for aid workers. People in slums cannot socially distance. It's simply not an option. And most importantly, they're getting hungry or lack water because it's about access and they don't have the access, or they lost the access because they lost their income. I'm thinking of the million rickshaw pullers in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. It's a country where I regularly go, where suddenly nobody has a job anymore because the traffic has come to a standstill. And those who want to get aid need to have the right connections. They need to have political access because, especially in Bangladesh, but of course in many other countries as well, help is politicized. You have to know people from the right party at the right level. And to add injury, what is it called? to make things even worse, Bangladesh has restricted access to internet so that people will not have enough information and will not know what is correct information and what is not. Our response to COVID-19 has been securitized. It's been approached with the rhetoric of war, and that is something that is, of course, it like Mark said, it leads to swift action, and of course I'm glad with that swift action. Don't get me wrong, but it is like a monster, like a machine. It gets things into place very quickly, but it also has lots of collateral damage, as I was indicating in my earlier talk. And I'm worried about taking a similar securitized war rhetoric to climate change, like we should act now, and politics should not get in the way of swift action, the kind of rhetoric that we get from Greta Thunberg and others. First of all, because of this collateral damage, and secondly, because it is not a problem for everybody. There are people who will actually stand to benefit from climate change or climate variability. People like in Afghanistan and in Nepal will probably have better access to water and be able to diversify their crops because of climate change. And secondly, the kind of measures that are proposed to take, whether it's big dams to act as climate buffers or coastal zoning, in themselves could be very helpful, but they will displace people. And if they are being displaced in a climate of war, then there will be very little mercy on the situation in which they will be displaced. So let's avoid what Andrea Oels has called the climatization of security, in which everything that is attributed to climate, such as climate migration, climate wars, even public health is seen as a kind of revenge of Mother Nature now, the COVID-19. If every issue is put into a climate domain and made subject to the logic of security, we're going to have this issue of the relentless authoritarian response that may be needed when a panic, when a sudden unexpected issue comes up, but certainly not in a more secular development such as climate change, in which we fortunately still have time to look at the secondary effects of our options.
Thank you very much. With those introductory statements, we'll pass back now to Martin for questions for our panelists.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for these very useful, very broad and very important introductory statements. I would like to now move on with the moderated questions. And the first question I have goes to Cecilia Tortajada. Can you explain to us, why is water such a wicked crisis? People in the academy call it a wicked crisis. And do we have enough water globally to feed our growing populations and to provide enough water for health and sanitation?
We do, Martin. We have enough water. But as we have written, I guess all of us have written before, water is scarce, water is polluted. So that limits the amount of water that can be utilized for any use. Do we have enough water to grow food? Yes, we do. Because we don't depend anymore on the traditional agriculture. The number of companies, and I live and I work in Singapore, and we see this trend here. The number of high-tech food companies that are being established in the world, that's a very good sign, because you're having in much more smaller spaces and with much less resources, not only water, but also energy when managed properly. You can see high production, high intensity of vegetables, of meat substitutes, of aquaculture. So yes, we can, but like Jerome was saying, we have to do it in a different, within a different concept, that is a different framework. The situation is changing. We have resources that are scarce, polluted. We are many in the world. That is true, but they can also be managed. And they can be managed by the proper decisions and by not politicizing. And technology is helping, but technology will help only if we have had our management and our governance in place. And I do think that there are many possibilities to grow the food we need, to have the water we need, except we have to use this management that has been neglected for a long time.
Our next question is for Rachel McDonald. Movements like Global Climate Strike and Extinction Rebellion have in the past few years called for wide-scale action to address climate change. What would this concretely mean for water and climate?
Thank you, Rachel. Isn't it shocking that water is such a stress resource and we see no strikes out there? There is no movement saying use our water better, particularly a lot of the areas we're working on. We are using the next generation's water. It's unsustainable, it's non-renewable, all those things that we deal with. So I always find it strange that we don't have those demonstrations. We came in on we supported the UN Climate Actions Summit in September, and we wrote EMI wrote the background paper on water for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And we know that people, people in other organizations had to really fight to get that water chapter into the report on Global Commission on Adaptation. People say, oh, water's everywhere. It's in the Paris Agreement. It's here, it's there. It's not, well, it's everywhere, but it's nowhere. There is no concrete set until we have this Global Commission on Adaptation on how to tackle global issues of climate change and water. What we've got from the Global Commission on Adaptation, we have 4 water tracks, which anybody who works in water are hardly going to disagree with. We have to use water more sustainably, something all our speakers have just mentioned. We have to manage droughts and floods. We have to use nature-based solutions. And we also have to improve governance and finance. And the way they're looking at it, they want us to look at it in terms of taking those 4 water action tracks and looking at preparedness, and then resilient basins and also resilient cities, which speaks to what Cecilia was just saying. So there are movements, there are areas that we can get behind, but I know many people just saying, where can we find that Greta for water? Perhaps listening to what Jeroen's saying, perhaps we don't want a Greta for water, but it would be great to somehow increase the bringing water onto the climate change agenda, because when you go to those COPs and that, it's nowhere. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jeroen, the next question goes out to you, and I must explain it a bit. A few weeks ago, Jeroen gave a webinar to our students here, and he came up with one very interesting observation. And he said, well, he asked us, how is the crisis of 2020 different from the crisis of 2008? And what have we failed to learn from this last crisis when it comes to the environment? Jeroen didn't have an answer to us, or we didn't have an answer, but maybe Jeroen has an answer for us now. Please, Jeroen.
Well, not the answer, but certainly I can make some observations, Martin. First of all, 2008 was an economic crisis that had a lot to do with speculation. And you remember the subprime crisis leading to an oil price rise and commodity prices, which in turn led to food prices going through the roof. And that meant that whole populations could not afford food. That's not the case now. We haven't seen as yet a major food price rise at a global scale. That's lucky. But at the same time, the economic impact might be much deeper. I'm not a crystal ball person. That this is simply what I'm reading. I'm parroting that the economic crisis might be much deeper than last time. At this time, one difference is that many countries, including China, which is now the global hegemonic power, as the US is simply abdicating its role in that, I would say. China and other countries have started to acquire, invest in large tracts of lands for emergency food growing, which means that it's no longer accessible to the countries leasing out that land, which again has a big major consequence for those people who depend on transhumans or herders, for example. So we are in a different situation in terms of land acquisition and land ownership and tenure relationships than 10, 12-year relations. But we also have a different leadership. I was already mentioning the US. At that time, Obama became the president, and he was very reliant on science, which is why he also had an Ebola plan. In this case, we have a world leader who doesn't have a clue. Which means that we cannot expect international organizations like WTO, like WHO, to come together and arrive at some kind of major coordination. So everybody will probably go their own way, and that means that the renationalization, which we already saw in after 2008, we will see in a bigger. More intense on a more intense scale right now, and that's not going to be good. So there are differences in terms of the leadership, in terms of land tenure, and possibly also in terms of the depth of the crisis. So what's that going to mean for access to water, or to virtual water in the sense of food, agricultural products? Probably it's going to be worse than last time, and there are no structural lessons learned from 2009. In 2009, everything was going to be different. We would see the end of capitalism. We would see the resurgence of states coordination and global coordination. That's simply not happening.
Thank you very much. Rachel?
Our next question is for Mark Mulligan. Mark, what are the key intervention points to address climate change, speaking from a biophysical perspective?
Okay, thank you. I think there are a number of these. First in my mind, I think, is energy and resource efficiency. This is often forgotten, but actually one of the most important ways of addressing all environmental change. Do not waste water, do not waste energy, do not waste material, land and soil. And of course, this has impacts on everything we do: farming, travel, heating, industry. There is waste in all of those sectors, and reducing waste is a key intervention. Beyond that, renewable energies are very important, of course, in reducing emissions from fossil fuels. And unlike fossil fuels, renewable energies will not run out in the same way. However, renewable energy is not without environmental costs. We need to be aware of that, and is, also currently rarely carbon free when you account for the full life cycle costs of renewable energy. So energy efficiency is still critical, even with renewable energy. We need to leave tropical forests intact. These are huge carbon stores on often poor agricultural land. They sequester new carbon from the atmosphere every year and lock it up in soil and timber. And we need to find ways of stopping cutting them down, because they're more valuable standing. And there are all sorts of challenges to doing that, but it's certainly a key intervention. We need to do agriculture better. For example, reducing tillage, in which we turn over soil, exposing the subsoil to the atmosphere, leading to oxidation of soil carbon, contributing directly to atmospheric carbon dioxide, whilst also degrading soil structure and biology, and thus enhancing flooding and soil erosion. Reducing tillage has benefits for atmospheric carbon dioxide and benefits also for everything we do at the land surface. In general, I think we need to rethink everything we do and ask ourselves, why are we doing it this way? And is that still the best way of doing it? Particularly for things like tillage that we really started 4,000 years ago, when systems and conditions were very different. We need to understand where amplifying positive feedback cycles in the climate system are, because these are the things that really are the COVID equivalent. If we hit one of these, there's very rapid change. And we need to understand where they are. We need to manage to avoid these positive feedbacks that accelerate climate impacts. For example, the thawing of permafrost. And then finally, I think we need to manage landscapes to reduce wildfire. This is a rapid and huge contributor to atmospheric carbon dioxide, as we've seen. We've had a year of catastrophes, and fire has been certainly very high on that agenda as well, almost forgotten about now, of course. This is a positive feedback cycle. Everything we are doing to landscapes is making them more prone to massive wildfires, undoing much of the good work that we're doing to mitigate and manage climate change in other sectors. So those are my key interventions.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will later on. We were going to, also summarize, the very different messages that have already come across today, which I think are fascinating, and we need to continue discussing them. But before we're going to do this, I'd like to ask Dean Mokhtar, provide us with this perspective from this region here, the Middle East. The Middle East is one of the most chronically water scarce areas in the world, but it's also facing a number of other issues, such as economic despair and so on. But what does this water crisis mean for this region here? Javier.
Thank you, Martin. I will go back and maybe amplify some of the key messages talked about earlier. I'm going to go back and reiterate what we know about the water resources in this region and the demand of the population and intensity. We all know that. I think to have a really closer look at the relationship between human water security, food security, and issues such as governance and technology. And I think there's a lot of discussions about very complex system. I will start with some very basic issues such as water use efficiency, water productivity in this region. Despite the water scarcity, the chronic water scarcity is still one of the lowest in the world. And I think there's a lot of issues involved there. Some of it is technological, some of it is governance, and some of it is habits, as Mark was mentioning earlier. So the use of hydroponics, the use of different technologies, intensifying agriculture certainly has a lot of room here. The basic issue among all of those is investment. And we've been talking to many of the investors. Unless the geopolitical situation is sorted out, very few big investors are willing to invest in agriculture in this region. And I think this is a basic issue that we really need to discuss. The geopolitics and the interaction with the sustainability is a critical issue. If I look back, water, a lot of the water that we have, even though this figure that I'm going to mention is debatable by many hydrologists, I would say about 80% of our water in Jordan, for example, is used for agriculture. In Lebanon is a bit less because of we're not using most of our land resources. That figure is too high. The water use efficiency is very low. So how can we wean? I'm gonna highlight that and bold that. Wean the agriculture from, Mark mentioned that. I think one of the benefits of minimum tillage is reducing the water footprint. And I think we need to go back to some of these technologies with a broader lens. Again, why do people do tillage? Some of it is for weed control, but it's impacting our water resources. It's impacting our plant water soil relationship. We need to have again, I will emphasize a system view to these. Where's governance? We have very poor water governance. There are no incentive for saving water. And again, the cost of water in this region is very high. That's a governance issue more than anything else. Technology. And again, I would go back and emphasize our investment in this region for R&D is the lowest in the world. And we need to invest more in R&D to develop technologies that are suitable for this. And again, I would question our relationship with the rural economies, and how can we promote rural economies to preserve soil, to preserve watershed, to preserve people and the heritage. And I think these discussions need to happen at the system view. We need to have a look at our cropping system. Do we need to plant bananas and citrus in Lebanon? And are there any other cropping system that we need to look at? Those decisions are not made strategically. We don't have a strategic planning for these very critical, important issues. And I'm happy we're discussing this among ourselves, but I really would like to see among us a policymaker, a business, a private sector, to really engage in a multi-stakeholder dialogue to allow us to take the science. What we know today is a lot. How much of that is impacting decision-making is very little. How much that is impacting incentivizing private sector investment is very little. I think this dialogue needs to include those sectors that are not here. But that's a longer discussion. But thank you for the question, very important and very relevant.
Our next question is for Joanne Warner. Is technology the game changer that can solve climate change? Or what are the social factors that would leave us overlooking?
Well, we can't do without technology. I certainly don't believe that we would even be here with this online communication without the the brilliant inventions of engineers. And engineers will almost never say that something is impossible. But there's limits to what engineering can do. Engineering, as I was already indicating in my earlier introduction, is not neutral. The interventions such as a dam or a flood wall or a zoning intervention to protect people from flood, for example, has a distributive effect among people. Some people gain, others will lose. So we cannot assume that technology alone will do the trick. We will have to complement the engineering profession with sociologists, and communication scientists, lawyers, people who look at it in a multidisciplinary fashion to see what does it do? Not only what does it mean, what will it do for reducing, say, global temperature, mitigating sea level rise, but also what will it do for different groups in society who will benefit, who might need to be compensated, and what interventions might be maybe not be so smart after all if you look at it into more depth. So yes, engineering for sure, but not only engineering.
Thank you, Jeroen. I mean, when we're talking about technology and other responses, at some point we have to also address the issue of governance. And COVID-19 shows us how different models are evolving or becoming more visible. And my question to Cecilia Tortajada is, do you think that the Asian approach to governance, whether it's COVID-19 or environmental governance, is superior to the Western more neoliberal approach? Or do you think that Asia could present an alternative to the world in order to manage resources and crises?
I do think that Asia presents an alternative to the world, but at the same time, there is no such thing as Asian governance. Asia is very big. It has 2/3 of the population of the world. It has the largest democracy. It has the second biggest economic power. It's very diverse. It's mostly developing. And while you see much progress in China, you have the developed Asia with Japan or with South Korea. You see enormous poverty in other countries, poverty which has been there for a long time, several generations, and it doesn't improve. So I don't think there is such thing as a governance type in such a big region, in no region, even within a country like India, that is a subcontinent, would be very difficult to think on a type of governance. However, I do think that there is a different, the world is seen with different eyes. Every country has entered this race. The world is seen for development and for greediness and for richness. But there is consideration for values. There is consideration for thinking situations through. Decisions are taught. At least I cannot talk for all of Asia. I can think for what I know more, which is Singapore, for example, and China, certainly. Decisions are thought through. And there are decisions that are radical for big problems, big solutions, radical solutions that bring change. And of course, society is very diverse. But people understand that in many cases, they have to take part of this. They have, for these drastic solutions or decisions to be beneficial, to bring results, you have to be part of them. And during this COVID-19 situation, while in China it was well understood, and Professor Xia, one of the former presidents of IAA, he lives in Wuhan, and we were communicating. I'm sure you communicated with all your friends in China during this time. And of course, everybody was stressed, but of course, everybody understood that was the way to go. And you take this situation to Europe, and people are fighting for the freedom. And you think it's not your freedom what should worry you. It should worry you that your family is safe, that your problem doesn't become the problem of others. So we see it with different eyes. And of course, we see it with our cultural baggage, and that is the one we're used to. And for each one of us, that is the environment we want to be in, but we have to be very careful, not in our different countries, not to bring things like out of proportion. This is a problem that is unprecedented, and unprecedented decisions and situations are needed. And if we go into the city hall armed because we want our freedom back, we are missing the point. And that is something that you won't see in Asia as a whole.
Our next question is for Rachel McDonald. Much of your professional experience has been working with international organizations that address cross-border issues like agricultural water use and climate change. What will the role of such organizations, or how will it need to shift in response to anti-globalization backlash of recent years and that we're seeing again now during COVID-19?
Thank you, Rachel. It's been fascinating hearing the different responses to the questions that we were just hearing about Asia. Is there an Asia context? And of course there isn't. And of course that sense is there a global, an organization as an international organization, do we come up with a global framework? Well, no, we don't. So EMI has, we know the water should always be managed locally. It's political, environmental, social, and economic context is always specific, that it's unique. So to be able to say, we have a global set of ideas that we can transfer across these river basins or groundwater discharges or cities, it doesn't come through. And so with our 14 regional offices, it's fascinating talking to those heads of office. The challenges in West Africa are different to East Africa, are different to Northern India, to Nepal or Myanmar. So within an international organization, we work on quite different challenges. Central Asia, I've just been reviewing a report on climate change in Central Asia, and this is the melting glaciers and all that. So we have to have a set of maybe ideas, increase water sustainability, things like Rabi's been talking about, things that Mark's been talking about, all the presenters have been talking about, but how do they come out? And your question talked about cross-border, and cross-border plays out in many different ways. So many of the areas we work in, we have rural-urban cross-border water challenges. So Rabia was talking about the demand for water, but also that, you know, balancing that demand for water for agriculture with water for cities, for Lebanon versus supplying Beirut as supplying the Orontes Valley with water. We can see that in many different areas. So we have federal rivers, and this again plays out in different ways. How do you share that water across states and cross-country flows? And one of the areas that I always find a little bit frustrating is that we often talk about water quantity, but water quality is equally as challenging. So what are those high nitrate levels or sediment levels or salinity levels as they flow across those cross borders? One of the areas we've been looking at is the circular economy. So looking at, can we take treated wastewater and bring that back into the water system? So treated wastewater, so it's either the water coming into an urban areas or the urban areas coming back out into agricultural areas. How can we try to diffuse some of those cross-border tensions and make it a lot more joined up? And so cross borders are important areas that we have to think through. The stresses between the Ministry of Water and Ministry of Agriculture plays out in every country I've ever worked in. But there are solutions, some of them technical that Jerome talked about, some of them, most of them are political and governance, and they are the typical difficult ones. So thanks for a great question.
Thank you, Rachel. You know, as you said before, water is everywhere, nowhere. And, you know, we had these very different and very interesting, exciting comments that, you know, we need to manage water locally, but we also need some international collaboration. We actually need more international collaboration. But how to do it is very challenging in an increasingly nationalist environment or nation state environment. So let me ask the next question to Mark. Could data perhaps be a game changer? Could data be an opportunity to manage the coming water and climate crisis? And what lessons can we take from COVID-19, if any? Because data has been very conflicting in the last few years. But we know, and just to highlight this to everyone, Mark sits on a vast data set, which is accessible via www.policysupport.org. So Mark's using very innovative Google solutions to understand water and climate. But from your perspective as a data scientist, can we use data more efficiently, perhaps bottom up?
Okay, thank you very much for an excellent question again. I think, in terms of lessons, there will never be full agreement on the science or the data. And we're seeing that very clearly in the management of the COVID crisis. Therefore, understanding of risk and uncertainty needs to improve in scientists, in politicians, in resource managers, and actually in the general public too. There's no such thing as a simple answer. There's no such thing as a certain answer in many of the things we're dealing with. We are not in a laboratory. The world is much more complex than that. And so, understanding uncertainty is vital. I think there are also interesting lessons from data science and climate science for COVID, as well as the other way around. In climate science, for example, we never use one model to drive policy. That is not done. We use an ensemble of many models, 17, 21 independent models, and we look at the central tendency of those models, we look at the variance between them, and on that basis, we advise policy. To advise policy on a single model is something we did in climate science maybe 30, 40 years ago. We don't do that now. More data and voices need to be heard in all crisis management, and that is because there are rarely silver bullets. Different solutions apply in different contexts, and you need sophisticated data, ensembles of models, ensembles of data, understanding of uncertainty in order to identify those differential solutions in different contexts. Those on the front line know this. So-called leaders don't seem to know this. I think there's another lesson here, and that's around targets. Data and targets are fundamentally connected. And whether we're talking about targets in climate change or targets in personal protective equipment, they can be helpful particularly in maintaining or saving reputations, but are only useful in solving the actual problems if they're honest targets and if they actually address the problem at hand. And in climate, for example, why do we hear so much more about the Paris Agreement 2-degree target, which is a collective responsibility that's not easily attributable to nations, than, for example, energy efficiency targets that are attributable to nations who can then be held accountable for their meeting them or otherwise. And I think keeping within 2 degrees is obviously important, but it's not an operational target. Keeping within 2 degrees requires much more focus on the operational targets that would get us there. Things like targets around energy efficiency, even if those targets aren't as simple as the 2 degrees is. I think the other lesson around data is that the science policy interface needs further work. Disaster science, as we're seeing, is highly politicized, and this generates challenges of political cherry picking of scientific data and of scientific messages to suit the purpose of politicians, hiding behind science, hiding behind scientists, again, to suit political purposes. A more open approach to the science and policy interface is important, whether we're talking about climate science or the current crisis. And then finally, in climate change, as in COVID, we will probably be looking to adopt the least worst option, because a best option may not exist to get through these crises. Business as usual may not be possible. Change will be revolutionary. We therefore have to get used to the radical uncertainty and revolutionary change that we have seen. And in terms of data, the positive is that we've seen real progress in fast and open source science to address the COVID crisis. We can learn from this approach, open, evidence-based approach, and on how it links to policy to learn lessons for the environmental crisis. We can see where we've gone wrong, and we can see what has worked, and there will be many interconnections there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Our next question is for Dean Mokhtar. Dean Mokhtar, what are the integrated approaches that we need to flatten the climate and water curve moving forward?
Thank you, Rachel. A very important question. I'd like to touch on, linked to this question, is the issue of transboundary. And the fact that this COVID crisis has showed us what we scientists knew, that solutions need transboundary issues. So when a country, one of the drawbacks that, in my opinion, the SDGs focused on is the national targets, and they missed the transboundary effect. When a nation is optimizing based on what their resources are and the impact on transboundary is ignored, I think we are doing a disservice to globally achieving the sustainability. I'll make a simple example to amplify my point. If a country that's producing fertilizer for its own national interest decided to reduce the fertilizer because fertilizer production uses energy and it uses water. So for their domestic interest and allocation, they decided to reduce the fertilizer production. That has a huge implication on food security globally. So what mechanisms we have to really make those decisions, and what lessons that COVID-19 had provided us with, that we really need to have global decision-making process as a platform where, yes, there will be some losers and there will be some winners, but we can share the benefits. And I think to answer your question, these resources, these decisions are interlinked, but yet we don't have a platform that allow us to look at those as a bundle. And these systems are interlinked. Mark mentioned the climate system, the energy system, the farming system, the agriculture. Those are highly interlinked. We know that. We have been working for the last 20 years on quantifying these interlinkages, but yet there's no platform that allow us to implement what we know today for a better decision-making that look for the benefit of all. And I think we're still looking at national interest. We're still looking at the boundary of our political boundary. And I think there is a lot of lessons, in my opinion, learned that with the COVID-19, this is a global crisis that really rise up to working all of us together to solve it. Can this translate into the system that you're talking about, Rachel, that allow us to really look at the global benefit for all? And I think we're not there yet. I don't have the answer, but I think this is the evidence that COVID has showed us, that the interlink of the resource system, but also of the global community. And let's see how can we learn out of this. And I think if I go back to Jaren's earlier comparison between 2008 crisis and 2020, the common denominator is this nexus of the health, the energy, the food, the human safety issues are all interlinked. In my mind, that's what's common. But have we reached a point that we need to mobilize a global solution for these that will allow us to quantify these transboundary effects at the system level? I don't think we have, but let's hope that the science community can promote this systems thinking and actually promote the benefits, economic, social, environmental benefit to these systems approaches.
Thank you very much, Dean Mokhtar, for what I found a very interesting, useful answer. I would like now to open up to the next part, which is the Q&A part. Those of you who join us from YouTube, please send messages either by comments on YouTube or send a message to our Twitter account, which is Food Security FSP. you can find us there. I would now like to hand over the next question to Louise Saron. She is based in Cairo, and the floor is yours, Louise.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm very interested in the concept of co-disaster that was put forth by Dr. McDonald in her opening statement, especially looking at the amplifying effects of COVID-19 on droughts in various countries, especially Morocco. The long-lasting drought and global pandemic are having very dire consequences on that country's GDP, as agriculture makes a large chunk of it. However, farmers are still tilling the land, they're feeding animals, and harvests are looming. So outside of the very clear economic backlash that these two crises are having, I would like to know what are the sanitary and health consequences for vulnerable rural populations across the Middle East from water scarcity or drought, coupled with COVID-19. And I guess my questions would go either to Dr. McDonald or Dean Mokhtar. Thank you very much.
So perhaps we start with Rachel McDonald and then over to Dean Mokhtar.
Thank you, Louise. It's an excellent question. It's something we're grappling with all the time. What we do know in the Middle East is when there is a drought, it tends to be the water allocation is that humans are prioritized first. So the idea is that where you have a much reduced amount of water, the other water sectors, their water allocation is removed. So in Morocco, we know that in a number of those key basins, Mesa and Umar Rabia, there is already water cut off from the irrigation. So to make sure that there is enough water going to the rural communities and to the urban centers that those river basins serve. What we're hearing is that some of that water isn't enough. What we do know is that in many of these rural areas, there isn't, social distancing is more easy, but we also know that many people are returning from urban centers to the rural, maybe, bringing COVID with them, so the ability to wash. What we also know in a number of those areas is the water isn't clean to start with. So we have, maybe you're able to not be susceptible to COVID, but you might have diarrheal infections and things like that. So we know there are issues to do with this. And it's sort of, if that's the sort of first set of ripples. The other set of ripples is that we understand that in many countries during a drought, there is an increase in illegal well drilling. So yes, the water has been cut off from the public irrigation systems and the public water supply systems, but the irrigation continues. And so it's another set of challenges of, well, the illegal well will still be there tomorrow when, as Mark mentioned, we will have the vaccine for COVID. So no, complex issues to balance.
Martin, would you like me to?
Please go ahead, yes.
Thank you, Luis. This is very insightful question. I'd like to maybe give some perspective locally to what we've been doing here in Lebanon and specifically at AUB. The link between COVID, health, and food cannot be separated. People on the street today, not because they're not afraid for their life and for the risk of infection, but because they're hungry. And I think we need to, one of the aspects that we have been learning more and more, especially with COVID in Lebanon, is the tight link. And I'm gonna cite one example that really looked at this integrated solution. A food basket that's generated locally, that can promote local production, that can improve the economic and well-being of rural communities, can also keep people away from the street, that can help in the safety and in the battling COVID. So I think what you're raising is an extremely important aspect, especially as Lebanon in particular is battling with an economic crisis, is battling with a rural migration issue because people don't have, they cannot survive on their land. So how could we take this as an example of promoting system-level solution, integrated solution that can address the stay-home kind of drive, but at the same time can address the food safety, food security of these individuals, that allow them to stay home because they're out of their home because of they're hungry, but can also benefit small communities, farming communities, the producers, to buy from them that food basket that will be distributed to poor communities to stay home. And I think this is one example to really amplify your question that needs to be scaled up. And I think these solutions are there. Again, the financial issues is a challenge. Who's going to pay for it? But I think those needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mokhtar. I would now like to hand over to Sami Kayed, who joined us from Beirut, actually. He's the manager of the Natural Conservation Center here at AUB. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody. Great conversation. Happy to be here with you. My question is kind of tied to what Dean Mokhtar was just also referring to. I mean, we're going through, as some of you may know, a massive economic collapse in Lebanon, but it's looking like we're going to have economic depression the world over. So I'm just interested to know, and I leave this question open to whoever might want to give some insight on it. When costly technology is a decreasingly likely solution amidst these economic crises, how can we formulate models or approaches that act more resourcefully and make do with the social and natural resources, or any other resources that we can conjure, really, the ones available in communities living on the front lines of the water and climate crisis? You know, I'm just thinking a little bit about how can we move away from this model of relying so much on foreign aid for these communities that are at the front lines as foreign aid becomes increasingly less accessible and effective, perhaps, in these kinds of situations. Thank you.
Anyone who would like to volunteer to answer this question? Yes, Mark, please go ahead.
I'll make a first contribution. I think that's also a really insightful question. I think a key aspect of this is to do better instead of always trying to do more. For example, reduced tillage, as I mentioned, is cheaper than more tillage. Energy efficiency is cheaper than more energy. I think the real challenge is that sometimes the incentives do not allow that. The incentives are perverse incentives that actually drive us towards less sustainable practices, that drive us towards doing more instead of doing better. And so I think, you know, those top-down incentives need to change in order to allow innovation from the bottom up. Because at the bottom, I think people know what to do to improve their lives. It's just that the incentives often don't help them.
Martin?
Yes, please.
Sami, this is a very insightful question, as Mark said. Let me comment on it at a bit broader and reflect on the importation of everything we have. Our food system, even what we produce, is dependent on seeds coming from outside. I'll give you the example of potato. Lebanon and the region use potato as a staple food, yet we import the potato seeds from Holland to allow for farmers to grow them. And without going and citing other examples, let's keep on the potato. What prevents us in Lebanon and in the region to modify potato seeds for our local environment? What prevents us from really having local innovations that make it cheaper? So the potato seed that is produced locally, farmers don't use it because it does not produce as much as a Holland imported potato. So your question is very relevant, and it will become relevant more and more as we lose the hard currency to import these technologies from the outside. So my short answer is make it local. Innovation has to, as Mark said, has to be bottom up, but I would add to it bottom up, but local. That would make it cheaper, more affordable, that can be deployed to a farming sector in Lebanon and in the region that is running on a very low profit margin. It cannot be expensive, otherwise it will not be competitive.
Excellent. Anyone else who would like to answer this question?
Yes, Martin, I would like to make a comment that refers more to what Ravi just said. And the context of Singapore is very different because it's urbanized and the socioeconomic conditions are different. But it's very much, Ravi, what you just mentioned, the government of Singapore imports about 90% of the food that is consumed because Singapore is too small. So you have to decide how you use the land. But it has to be, they have taken the decision, because people are also asking for it, that there should be more production locally. Because people feel more, they would like to buy more what is produced in Singapore. And this is also directly related with food security. So Singapore trades with 170 countries, so it has enough supply to bring from whatever it needs. And Singapore is very small, so the amount of food that requires is also not that big compared to the global market. I mean, the global market compared to other countries. So this is where Singapore has developed, already announced several months ago, last year, the 30-30 vision, which is by 2030, 30% of the nutrition, not food, but the nutritional value that is consumed in Singapore is going to produce within Singapore. And this will be precisely with what I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, with the highly intensive, the food companies, the ones that produce indoors. And they are going into a business model that suits Singapore, and of course enough attractive for the companies to come here, because it also has to be affordable. Singapore, people think about Singapore that is this very expensive place, but the truth is that we eat with $5 a day, a balanced food and I mean, big portions. And the government wants to keep it at those levels. Food that is a larger proportion of food that is produced inland and that also is affordable. So that I just wanted to comment on that. It's different realities, but at the end, countries are looking for being able to produce locally, whatever they can produce locally, good quality, and also at affordable prices. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I would now like to allow John Russell to ask a question. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I really liked what Dr. Mulligan said in his introduction, that this crisis showed us another option, a change that we could see in how we operate within and across societies. And because, as Dr. Werner said, COVID affected the global middle class across a larger body of people than we normally see. But I'm wondering, in your opinions, do you think the crisis was acute enough to catalyze a change or a paradigm shift in regard to, as you said, the top-down environmental planning in terms of water management, and a search for the least worst option, as Dr. Mulligan put it? Or do you think there's going to be a recession back to what was previously normal across these mainstream international bodies and politics? I'm interested in anyone's opinion. I wasn't asking to anyone specifically.
Thank you, John. Anyone like to volunteer? Rachel, is it the hand? No.
I can say something to start with, perhaps.
Yes, please.
Okay. I don't know whether the crisis has been acute enough to really make us think of the environmental water crisis in a very different way. But I think, you know, we have now all experienced a crisis, which has not been the case previously for many. And I think, therefore, we have an understanding of how things change during a crisis that is acute. And I think that helps us to put ourselves perhaps in other people's shoes a bit better, but also helps us to think about going beyond the chronic, because for the world as a whole, climate change, water is a chronic issue, but for certain people, it's an acute issue, and the policy world, I think, is much more focused on the chronic aspects than on the acute, and I think now that we've all seen acute, we're more likely, I think, to have that in our mind in decision making in future.
Thank you, Mark. Rachel?
Thank you, John. That's a really interesting question. I think, will we return to normal? Well, who drives normal is an important set of ideas, and it's investors, it's major organizations, of course it's government. And how much will their demand for profit margins or whatever it might be, we have to think about what can bring about that change. The previous question was about the economic depression, and we've seen stock markets change, we've seen stock markets rally. There are a lot of influences well beyond the science, beyond the good thinking that we might have represented here. There will be those drivers, and I'm not necessarily optimistic that we will have that change. I think, people will be back out into the parks, will be going to restaurants, and I don't know how long the impact of this shock is going to be on people's psyche and the demand for change.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Jeroen, please.
Yeah, well, the literature on change after disaster or crisis seems to suggest that sudden changes, radical changes, are usually short-term, and the last long-term, you don't see a lot of radical change. But things that are less visible before the crisis may be accelerated by the crisis. So in that sense, it might actually be that a undercurrent of awareness, for example, that was already highlighted by the Day Zero a couple of years back in Cape Town, might come back with a vengeance. That kind of environmental awareness in the middle class, as I indeed said, that a disaster is only really a disaster when it hits the middle class. To come back to Cape Town, for people in townships, in poor areas, it did not make much of a difference that the reservoirs were running out, because they had poor water service anyway. But when the middle class is affected, then suddenly it makes the news, it makes CNN, it becomes, in the case of Day Zero, it becomes a household name, a label that was then applied to other droughts, like in Chennai, India, in Mexico City, in Lima. So many other cities are now also known, at least temporarily got known as Day Zero cities. And that seems to have stuck. And maybe a crisis like the COVID crisis can accelerate issues that are already in the global consciousness, but have not reached the top of the agenda yet. As I said, I'm not a crystal ball person. I may be a disastrologist, but I'm not an astrologist. But certainly, it is possible that a change can happen in a accelerating way rather than in a radically different way.
Thank you so much, Jeroen. We received another question here for Dean Mokhtar by Mohammed Al-Zohbi through Twitter. And he said, in the Middle East in general and in Lebanon especially, we have a lot of international organizations that were supposed to train locals and take responsibilities to manage their resources through development and empowerment projects. What needs to be done in order to scale this up? Why hasn't it worked in the past? Do you have an answer for this, Dean Mokhtar? Rabia, I think you're now unmuted. You're muted.
Okay, sorry about this. I started by saying that it's a good question. I'll respond to it and maybe scale it up a little bit, because I want to have thank you for the question, because you gave me the platform to talk about another section of this discussion that was never yet brought up. So first, in response to you, I think there is need to be a better policy or better coherence among these agencies. We all know that each agency comes in with a certain motive, but I think it's up to us, at the receiving end, to really work on a coherence, starting from the needs and be a catalyst for driving that aid into what is really needed, and that has been missing in my opinion. But in a bigger scope, what I'd like to really raise is the issue of awareness, the issue of education, the issue of capacity building in this region. And I'm going to pose a few questions. Many of us here are educators, and I really would like to pose a few questions. What are we doing to promote managing risk to our young generation and to our decision makers? What are we doing to promote decision making within crisis to our young generation and also to our decision makers? What are we doing to promote the non-stationarity in how we make decisions and in our system approach? I think these are fundamental questions. So I will take the opportunity with the questions asked to really ask the question to ourselves. Are we as a society prepared to really look into this at the system level? And how can we work together to be in a position to negotiate, to be in a position to develop better coherence among the donor community to meet our needs? And I don't think we are doing our job properly.
Thank you, Dean Mokhtar. I have what I think the final question from Abed Yahya, and he's worried that water might be weaponized in the global pandemic. And this leads us to perhaps the question of questions we always get asked in water science. Do you think there's a scenario for water wars emerging from such crises, also from the climate crisis? I mean, you're shaking your hand. Maybe I, start with Rachel McDonald and then, ask everyone, because I think that's a very useful and interesting discussion we should have.
It's as ever, and it's a question that's arisen down through the decades. I always look to the work of Oregon State, and they've done a lot of work on water diplomacy and Aaron Wolf's group, and I've actually led with the Arab Water Academy. We had host sessions on water diplomacy where they were teaching negotiation skills and diplomacy skills because of many of those intransigent water issues across borders in the Middle East, North Africa region. And I always come back to his figures that water has often been more a case for supported diplomacy than for wars. So I'm an optimist. I do believe that it won't lead to that, but we have to be supporting governments to bring in smarter water solutions to ensure that this doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cecilia, what's your take on the water war narrative?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. We all study we all have different fields of study. We all have our ideas, but the water wars are so over-marketed, and they will always appear in the news. Like Jerome said, it's a crisis if you have the middle class, right? But you bring the water war, and then all of a sudden, all the media know they can sell it, and people read about it, and they won't happen because there are systems that, and it won't be the water. There will be many other reasons before the water, right? But before we finish, and I don't know if this is my last chance for an intervention, I would like to bring the attention to a very, very important topic, which is the SDGs. And how much back the world is going back because of the COVID-19. And we just hope, we should hope as a society that they are not forgotten. Yes, it will be more difficult, not only in terms of water, all our indicators and targets that have increased with time because we are not able to solve them. But that they are not forgotten, not politicized, not forgotten, because humanity needs it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I think to highlight the role of refugees is, of course, a very acute topic in this region here. Refugees indeed play or must play a very important role in policy making. But coming back to this question, Jeroen, what is your take? Do we see perhaps more migration as well coming out of a water crisis? I know you've done some work with a large group of European scientists on this question.
Well, I work with our colleague Ingrid Boas, who indeed is part of a great migration network. And they're finding that the reason why people migrate is, boringly enough, it's never a single factor. People make decisions to move on a host of conditions, including environmental conditions, livelihoods, but also, is there a place to go? Is there a network that that allows the mobility, or as their case may be, especially for women, immobility? People women may want to go and find work elsewhere, find a home elsewhere, bring their family elsewhere, but they, for cultural or economic reasons, not be able to do that. So the climate migration actually isn't a thing, at least. There's not a lot of evidence for that, and the same goes for environmental migration. We still need to have a lot more evidence before we can say anything about that. And in terms of water wars or its 21st century incarnation, climate wars, it's the same thing. There is no evidence for state-to-state water wars. The water war in Bolivia was actually a water riot. So it is, as was said before, a very attractive, media-friendly narrative, but there's very little on the ground to support that. Very recently, I saw a post by World Water Resources Institute, who are in a consortium with IHE and other Hague-based organizations, which claims that they can predict where conflicts will be breaking out and say that water will be a great part of that. It's as if we could say, okay, on 7 October, Mali will have an intervention to get its water resources by its neighboring states. That's not how it happens. So I think there is definitely an issue of structural water conflict, of lack of access, of other issues that may culminate into water becoming highlighted, as it has been on the Nile and in South Asia, because water is so visible, it's so easy to highlight. So if you have a problem with your neighbor already, water is an excellent way of getting it on top of the agenda. But actual water wars, no.
Thank you. Anyone else to address this question?
I can add a little, perhaps. Martin, I think
yes, please.
Crises often lead to conflict, but I think, you know, as others have said, wars are likely to result from many issues, of which water is only one. And of course, at this stage in the COVID pandemic, we are starting to see a culture of blame and a culture of transfer of blame or responsibility. And I think, you know, similar things, of course, happen in the water world. This is where data is important. Who we think is using our water versus who is actually using it can be very different. And I think it's important that for shared resources, internationally shared resources like water, that these are carefully and independently monitored to avoid politically motivated myths leading to conflict. And you know, that's not easy, of course, but I don't think in the same way that we do for climate and now for your biodiversity, we don't have fully independent, comprehensive monitoring of shared water resources as we do with the shared atmospheric resource.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Dean Mokhtar, would you, I mean, are you afraid of perhaps a water war in the Euphrates and Tigris or the Nile?
No, I agree. I think I agree with all of my colleagues' statements. And actually, I'd like to maybe reflect on two things that, on the contrary, I think what COVID might have taught us is two set of interconnected systems. One is the global connectedness of all of us, that this is a global crisis that can only be solved with a global cooperation rather than the other. The other is the interconnectedness of these primary resources with the economy and intertwined health, food, water, climate issues. And I think I hope that the lessons learned from this is that we really look at these two interconnected systems, the primary resources and the global connectedness as we move forward post COVID-19 in a more positive way in which decisions are being made, and in rather than being in a war and conflict. I hope that these interconnectedness really reflect our vulnerability as a global society, and then bringing passion to the global community, which we haven't seen in the past.
Thank you very much, Dean Mokhtar. I would like to wrap up now. I think this has been a fascinating seminar with loads of different messages and messages we really need to take into account. First of all, I thought that there's no vaccine to climate change is a very important point. Water's everywhere but nowhere, so we don't really yet address the problem on a strategic level. And actually what we're seeing now is we're seeing this crisis of global leadership. The US was in charge in 2008. Now there isn't anyone really in charge. I think countries are going back to the nation state level. And that's indeed very worrying. However, what we learned is the data, the more decentralized way of addressing perhaps crises can play an important role. So the next decade will surely be defined by more data, and we probably need to find ways to upscale our data responses. Then I think Asia, the Asian model, where they really take strict action, was highlighted as a way of responding to a mega crisis such as climate change. But again, in Western democracies, it's not so easy. So also for this, we need to find ways to address this topic. I would like to thank everyone for this wonderful opportunity today to have you with us. I would like to thank everyone who attended the seminar. Just as a last announcement, next week we'll have a seminar on the impact of COVID-19 on nutrition security with World Food Prize laureate Lawrence Haddad of the Gain Alliance, with Patrick Webb of Tufts University, with Lauren Landis, who's responsible at WFP for nutrition. She's monitoring the global response on nutrition. Nakhla Hawala from AUB and Dr. Lamis Joma from AUB. So join us next week. In 2 weeks, we have another session on global food systems and what we can learn from COVID-19 with Robert Parberg of Harvard, with Tom Hurtle of Purdue, and Chris Perry, former World Bank economist, and Tony Allen from London, and myself. So we're looking forward to welcoming you again. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this meeting today. And yeah, I hope to see you soon at some point in person. Thank you so much.
Good to see you all. Thank you.